It is obvious that this contest cannot be decided by our knowledge of the Force, but by our skills with a lightsaber.
Hey Saber fans, this is graypaladin, bringing you the much anticipated comparison of the Saberforge Count Mark 1 and 2. So there are very subtle or very few differences between the two. The greatest difference we're going to see between these two sabers are the size. They're almost perfectly identical in design. So the Mark 1 is up top and the Mark 2 is on the bottom. Now I'm just going to go over the dimensions between the two so you can get an idea of the size difference between the two. So the Mark 1, from the tip of the bar on the pommel here to the tip of the claw, that has a length of 15¼ inches, where the Mark 2 is 14 inches even. The diameter of the Mark 1 is 1½ inches, where the Mark 2 was reduced to 1.3 inches. The blade depth, you're going to find the greatest difference. I installed the Mark 1 with NeoPixel and a CFX board, and the NeoPixel connector is right down here, and that gives a blade depth of 2.1 inches. If it were a LED, it would be the same because that's what the retention screw is for the lighting module. In the Mark II, this is a Hero Pixel, so it has their thread-in blade design, and the blade depth isn't quite as deep as the Mark I. In the Mark II, it's 1½ inches, and the blade screws in place to secure it there, where this just uses a standard retention screw. Looking at the resonance chamber, in the Mark II, when I installed this, the speaker is here in the body. That's the only place that I personally could fit it because I didn't know how to take this pommel section off to fit the speaker down here. So the speaker is up here, and you have this long distance for resonance, and that's 3½ inches, which honestly I believe is just too much. And it's a 24mm speaker, so the sound isn't that big. However, in the Mark II, Saberforge installed this saber, and they did place the speaker in the pommel, also a 24mm speaker. But the speaker is butted up directly against the base here, and so it really has no space for resonance at all. And as a result, the sound is a bit thin and not quite as loud as this 24, and this 24 is already subdued compared to a normal 28mm saber. So this is 0.2 inches here. The weights are quite a bit different by 4 ounces. The Mark I weighs in at 1 pound 8 ounces, and the Mark II comes in at 1 pound 4 ounces. Now, looking at the difference in sizes between the components here, the pommel in the Mark I has a 2-inch diameter, where the Mark II has a 1½ inch diameter. And you can just see how thick and large and bulky that pommel is in the Mark I. But if I pull out the Mark II, it's much more streamlined and has a smaller, less clumsy look and feel. If you can see that. And I even changed the perspective so you can still see that the Mark I is bigger than the Mark II. Looking at the red activation switches, in the Mark I, Saberforge was initially installing theirs with a button here and on the top of the neck, which was really an eyesore. But when I installed mine with the Crystal Focus 10, I used the red switch down here. I put the auxiliary in the top portion of the switch and the activation on the bottom portion, so I can teeter between the two, or press the middle for both at the same time to activate some of the menu options. For the Mark II, Saberforge did install the activation switch down here and down here alone.
More powerful than any Jedi.
which makes it difficult to use the saber's effects. And I cover that in the review of the Mark II. I'll slap a card up here so you can check that out. And I'll also have it in the end screen as well. As far as the size of the two switches go, in the Mark I, the red switch has a length of 1.5 inches, where the Mark II is 1.3 inches. So you're starting to see that kind of 0.2 difference, or in some of the larger stuff, maybe cut in half. The body length here in the Mark I is 3.7 inches long, where the Mark II is going to be 3.5 inches long. So again, we're reducing that by 0.2. The claw on the Mark I is significantly longer. That's 3.9 inches. Mark II is 3.5 inches. As far as the width here, it's a minuscule difference. It was by like 0.02 or something like that, so it's not even enough to even recognize, really. When I kind of look at these two sabers, when you touch it and hold it and feel it, the Mark II definitely feels much better in your hand compared to the Mark I. And when I first used the Mark I, I thought the Mark I was great, but I could tell that it was, a bit big. And Dooku's saber is smaller than a standard hilt saber. You hold that, like Saberforge's hilts are not big and bulky at all, not like Ultra Sabers. But Count Dooku's saber was designed to be a bit smaller than what you would see in a normal lightsaber. And I'm glad that the Mark II took that into account. Mark I, sure, it's close to screen accuracy, but Mark II nails it, primarily because of the proportions and the size. So speaking of the pommel, where we get most of the accuracy is right here. Mark I, you've got this portion here connecting to the pommel. That's the same diameter as everywhere else in the saber. Not true to the screen. But if you check out the Mark II, now you see that size is reduced. So it's going almost up to this bar here. It's really small, and you can look through that pommel there, straight through. Comparing those two, you can see the thickness of Mark I on the right, and then that narrowness of the Mark II on the left. Mark II is correct to the screen. Both sabers have the brass screws on either side of the pommel and the elbow. One thing I did notice, because the diameter is larger on the Mark I, those brass screws are flush to the side of the elbow. Mark II, not so much. It's the same size screw, but you can see there's that bit of lip there, a little bit of edge. It's not completely flush with the elbow. And that's on both sides of the Mark II. Now, another difference between the two is the screws on the bottom of the claw. So here on the Mark I, they've got these round screws here that they don't protrude, but you can feel them when you run your fingers across the top. And that's 1, 2, and 3, those screws. And you got retention here for the LED, and then a retention here for the blade. And there's another tiny screw in there that secures the edge of the claw down. Mark II improved on those screws, and now the screws are more flat. And you can see that. They blend in real nice, and it's a smooth all the way across the base of that claw. And it blends much better too. When you look at it from a distance, you don't really see them. Whereas the Mark I, they're very obvious. There is one blade retention screw here because there's no retention for a LED module because it's the thread-in system, which is going to be down on the inside there. When it comes to the modules and things like that, Mark II has the thread in. It does not have the option of doing just a standard LED or NeoPixel housing. You have to use that thread in, which is unfortunate because you limit to only being able to use a thread in blade from Saberforge. or that technology if you can manage to build one yourself. Whereas the Mark 1, that was before they offered NeoPixel, but you had you didn't have to. You have a choice. I mean, you didn't have to have that thread-in option because it wasn't available yet. At least it'd be nice to have the choice to say I want thread-in or I want a standard blade adapter, but we don't get that with the Mark II. Balance. This is where I have to say the Mark I has a bit of an edge over the Mark II. Because this is bigger, a little heavier, and thicker, when you put a blade in, it's more balanced when you're swinging the saber, more so across all hand positions on the saber. But when you're holding the Mark II with a blade in, it's most balanced when you're holding up here by the neck of the emitter. When you're holding the body, not that it's bad by any means, but it doesn't feel quite as free-flowing as it does when you're up towards the top. You kind of minimize the sweet spot of balance on the Mark II because of the size with this smaller hilt. You put that blade on there, now you have more weight on the front that's balanced on the back end, whereas the Mark I, because it's a bit heavier and longer, when you put that blade in, it's balanced more on the bottom end of the saber, so the blade doesn't feel quite as heavy or awkward. That's just one difference, but it's not enough to make or break, saying that the Mark II is inferior to the one. I mean, I think Mark II is superior to the Mark I by far. The switch. You would think because this is smaller that the switch would, feel better and be in a better position, but it's not because they only installed the switch on the bottom end of the red button, whereas here on the Mark I, it had holes, because I installed this myself. It had holes in the bottom and the top, so I was able to install two switches. And unfortunately, I don't know why Saberforge doesn't do more 2-button setups on their sabers or even offer that, because I think 2 buttons are much better than 1. And you'll see in the review of the Mark II, having the switch down on the bottom makes it difficult for manipulating the effects on the saber when you're using it. And then there's fingerprints. I don't know what the difference is, but when I touch the Mark I, yeah, it's a polished chrome, but you touch it, your fingers are staying on that saber. You're going to have fingerprints all over it. It's going to smudge and not look good over time, and you have to polish it up and wipe it off. And I did that before I started this video, and just touching it a little bit, I can already see the fingerprints and the marks on there. But the Mark II, I'm not really sure why, but it doesn't hold the fingerprints quite as bad as the Mark I does. And I'm assuming they would use the same materials, but for some reason the Mark II is not a smudge magnet like Mark I is. This falls on me, but I do like that the Mark II has this silver recharging data port on the bottom. I mean, sure, you still see it, but at least that it's silver, it blends in much more with the pommel. The Mark I, like I said, this was on me. I installed it with a black 2.1 millimeter recharge port, and that's a little more unsightly than looking at the Mark II. I'd rather see the silver than the black, but that's my fault. I should have found a silver version of that. So that's pretty much it between the two sabers. I think the Mark I is much more screen accurate. It looks better, it feels better. The size and proportions, how they reduced everything into a smaller package, really makes the saber much nicer. I will say that because everything is smaller, everything in there is much more tight. And I don't know how they did it, because I had a difficult time installing the saber, the Mark I. And after installing that, I told myself I'm not going to install another curved hilt saber. I've done that with the Vanquish and with this, and it's not an easy task, and it's a bit frustrating. So I just let Saberforge install the Mark II for me, and I'm glad that I did, because it's tight in there. It's really tight. But that's the vast differences between the two. Actually, the minuscule differences between the two. I definitely like and prefer the Mark II over the Mark I. I'm glad they made that improvement. And honestly, I don't think there's much more to do to this other than offering us a 2-button setup to control the saber. So I hope you enjoyed this comparison between the two sabers. Now that I have Mark II, my baby, to sit on the shelf and to enjoy, the Mark I has already been claimed by Darth Paradigm, and I will be shipping this off to him as he purchased this saber. So you can expect a video on his channel unboxing and reviewing this saber with his perspective, and also his his hopefully positive critique on how I installed this saber. Let me just fire both of these up so you can hear and see the glory that is Count Dooku. I'll first boot up the Mark I that I installed with the Crystal Focus 10. And I'll boot up the Mark II with the Golden Harvest V3.
This is just the beginning.
I did make a Neo chip for this. It is NeoPixel. As I said before, auxiliary switch here. And activation down here.
Sound bank selection.
Count Dooku.
Exit menu.
Count Dooku. I'm looking at another dead Jedi. You're about to experience true.
This is The Count's Claw by Kyberphonic. Another Dooku-inspired sound font. And the first
Sound bank selection.
I'm looking, Count Dooku.
is Duke by Kasith.
Count Dooku.
I did install Duke by Kasith on the Mark II. I did get a blade plug there, but unfortunately there's no shine through because of the thread-in blade technology that they use. So there we have it. The Saberforge, the Count Mark I and Mark II comparison. And now that I've got my beloved Mark II in place, we can take Mark I out of the picture and ship that off to Darth Paradigm. Thank you very much for watching, and may the Force be with you.